From Southern California, this is The Circle of Insight, a show about everything in psychology. Hear the latest in news and views on psychology. Our motto is simple: wherever there is psychology involved, we are there. And now, here's your host of The Circle of Insight, Carlos Vasquez.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Carlos Vasquez, doctoral candidate in psychology and the host of The Circle of Insight, where we discuss topics that you have chosen with leading experts. Our motto is simple: wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. Today we're talking about emotional intelligence, also known as EQ, with Nanci Besser. Thank you very much, Nanci, for joining us.
Thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Nanci is an emotional intelligence specialist, and what we talked about in part one of the show is what happens when you have a low EQ, emotional intelligence. What kind of an impact does that have for the business world? What kind of an impact does it have to your personal relationships? Today's show, Nanci is going to tell us a little bit about what she does to help people get better high EQ, not IQ. So Nanci, what are some of the things you notice when you walk into a business, when you work with them?
Well, I'm paying attention to what the team dynamics are. And basically, are there sort of like going back to your high school situation, right? If there's cliques, so if there's sort of the popular kids versus the unpopular kids, and looking at that. And normally what I tend to find is that those that the coworkers, as well as kind of the management as well, have identified as being the, quote, less popular ones, are usually also the ones that have a lower measure of EQ. And that the better performers, the kind of cool kids, are the higher EQs.
Interesting. So what do you do when you find these low EQ individuals? I mean, you post labels on them, and you try to work with them to find out where they're at, or you
no, labels don't really work that well. Although maybe trying some icebreaker game or something where they have stickers on.
There you go.
But no, what I really try to do is to identify the similarities among the groups. Because there's been so much focus, obviously, by usually the time they bring me in, on the differences. So I try to figure out what is a commonality that they haven't really expressed. So for instance, if I'm working with, let's say, a group of engineers who, on the whole, not to generalize too much, but tend to have a lower level of an EQ measure than those that manage them. Basically, I come into them and I try to figure out, well, how can we find a commonality? So the engineer, on a whole, wants to be able to express his or her ideas on how they want to do a specific project. So they enjoy designing, they enjoy the creative process, but really what they really want from all the work that I've done has kind of told me is that they want to be left alone to do it their way. They don't want to be managed. So that kind of poses a problem when they have a manager who wants them to do things a certain way. Then the engineer would tend to feel attacked. And again, going back into what we talked about in part one, that the only time that we defend ourselves is if we feel attacked, then you can see how there can be some major conflicts going back and forth. Then the management tend to view that the engineers, for example, are not really team players, that they don't have the best interests of the company or of the particular project in mind. So there ends up being this conflict of interest. But if they would just sit down and identify what they do have in common, rather than focusing on their differences, they can make some real change. So that's usually where I start with them.
So let's say Nanci finds this engineer, we'll just use engineer for now, but he has a low EQ, and the employer says, hey, can you help us out here? And you've identified one.
Right.
Okay, we have one low EQ person right there. What would you do to help them?
So what I do with them is I would talk to them about that their opinion is valid. Right? So basically, I validate them from the get-go because that's usually what they're looking for. Everyone wants to be heard. Everybody wants to know that their way of seeing the world has validity. And so if you're going to acknowledge someone's perspective, you don't have to agree with it, but just acknowledge it. That usually is a good place to start.
Interesting. That's great. And do you also do the assessment to find out where their EQ is?
Depending on where they are with their HR process, they may have already had an assessment. But if they don't, then I do usually do an additional interview or some other type of form of assessment, empathy quiz or something, even looking at the micro expressions like I was talking about. Yeah. There's a great one on the Greater Good website through Berkeley, through Paul Ekman's work as well, that helps you to identify micro expressions. And typically the engineers that I have worked with tend to have a challenge with that skill. And so that is something that we can work on. And also overall body language, how they're carrying themselves, their weight distribution. So I look at their body mechanics. That's where the Pilates and the mindfulness comes into, how they're breathing, their tone of voice. All these different things convey emotional intelligence, and their management is going to be looking at those measures for the employee.
Explain that a little bit to me. So how would you work with them in regards to their body language for themselves? And then maybe you can tell me a little bit. We actually kind of mentioned already using greater good might be to help them looking at other people. But how would you work with them in regards to body language? Do you tell them to stand up straight? Or I mean, what are you
Well,
doing?
I do it gently. But
Sure.
so normally what I do is I ask them to demonstrate to me their ideal posture and whatever that looks like to the individual. And I do this privately, so obviously they're not on display and I don't want to embarrass anybody. So usually just within a small conference room or something. And normally either somebody from HR or an assistant or something will be there as well with maybe a camera. But the camera is kept though only between the participant and myself, so that it's not exposed to the rest of the company, and the companies know that going into it. But basically, we all do so many different things when cameras are on us than when we're not thinking that people are watching us. And so I want to see the difference between how they're behaving when they don't have a camera versus when they do have a camera. Then also, I try to get a sense of what their baseline is. So if they tell me that they think like this is a great posture, then I would look at that and I would say, okay, so why do you think that that's great? Because I want to be able to, again, see things through their eyes and understand. So if they can tell me, well, this is a comfortable way of sitting, then I can say, yes, it is a comfortable way of sitting, but it might not convey the emotion that you want to. Because you sitting back like this makes you feel like maybe from your management's perspective that you're not as involved, or that you don't care as much, or maybe that you're actually physically distancing yourself from what's being said. So there's a bunch of different connotations that you can get just from basically dissecting small areas of body language.
It's amazing. It seems like a lot of self-awareness is involved.
There is a huge portion of self-awareness. And so within self-awareness, what I usually draw on also is practicing more self-compassion. So self-compassion is being able to learn how to identify with your own journey in life so that you're not comparing yourself to somebody else. But then also, if you can practice more self-compassion and mindfulness at home, you're going to be able then to extend it. Because there's nothing that you can experience and then extend without actually learning it more yourself as well.
So, like going along that little line of you get to walk in their moccasins?
Exactly.
Okay. I don't know the saying anymore, so I'm not even going to try it. Wait, so self-compassion, self-awareness, big things. One of the questions that came up when we were talking, is there a correlation between IQ versus low EQ?
Yes, and they're so easy to get confused.
Yeah, I've
so
noticed.
do not feel bad. And in some ways, I think that's why some people refer to EQ versus EI, because that's also another way to distinguish emotional intelligence.
No,
So
don't do that, yes.
whatever's easier for you.
No more acronyms.
But so what was really interesting about EQ compared to IQ is that they found in a research study by Daniel Goleman again that there was a 2 times more importance placed on EQ compared to IQ when you looked at the predictability of being able to determine if somebody was going to become a high performer or not.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And if you have a high EQ, is that inversely related to a low? I mean, is that low EQ
Not
related?
necessarily. Not necessarily.
Okay.
I certainly haven't seen any supporting documentation to support that. But what I would say from my own personal experience, that it does take a fair amount of IQ to be able to be open to the idea of EQ.
That's fascinating. That'd be a great study to find out as well. Very interesting. Okay, so we understand a little bit of how you go into the workplace and try to help them individually.
Yes.
Do you do any kind of group work for the business?
Yes, it depends on what the specific issue is that they've brought me in for, but I can either do a small group setting of kind of either a hybrid of the management and, let's say, for example, the engineers together, or I can do individualized groups between just the management or just the engineers. And so you're going to have very different dynamics, obviously, if you're mixing the two versus if you're having them be separated.
I was going to say.
Yeah, and basically it really depends on what the overall goal is of bringing me in. If it's just to identify how they can have better synergy together, then obviously I'm going to be sure that they have some interaction together. If it's more about how engineers can just do better with relating to being a team player or something, then I might be more likely to have a group of engineers together.
That's fantastic. So now we're going to go over to the personal relationships. Now, I'm assuming when you work with a couple, husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it may be, you're looking at them. Do you train them to see what the other person is expressing, body language wise, as well, maybe verbally?
So I definitely get into the biomechanics like I talked about, and I kind of have created this terminology of psychobiomechanics because it's combining the psychology with what our body carries as information. So our bodies are talking all the time, quote unquote, and that the information that we're conveying can either be positive or negative, or it can kind of be neutral too. So what I try to help clients do is to be able to recognize what their partner's body is saying to them, and then to look at, again, that idea of cognitive dissonance. Is it different than what the facial emotions are saying, or is there actually congruence between the two?
I want to stop you for a second, just in case our audience doesn't know. What's cognitive dissonance? We've
So,
heard that word a lot.
Cognitive dissonance means that you have a different display of emotion than the feeling underneath of it. So that means that the two things are not in alignment. And even goes further into deception analysis. People are looking at that all of the time. It's like the person who's smiling and, like I said earlier, is plotting your demise or something like that. Or who is disgusted underneath it, and that little flash of micro expression that we talked about too. Those are all different pieces of that cognitive dissonance. And then when you have congruence, then that's actually where you have your emotional state and the expression that you're displaying being into alignment.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
So you work with the couples to understand, read each other in a sense, get a good understand their body language, what they're doing, how they're expressing it, what their micro expressions are,
right,
somehow. Are they particular characteristics we all have? I mean, do we have certain...
I would say that on average, especially within a couple situation, that we do tend to misread our partner quite a bit, especially if there's something that we have a history with from another relationship, because a lot of times, even with all of our best intentions, we tend to see the history of our past relationships with our present situation. And so if there's something that kind of hits off sort of a red flag for you, or you're like, maybe that anybody else wouldn't have an issue with it, but you do, then that's going to put you on hypersensitivity or kind of vigilance to your spouses or mates' expressions, and being able to decide if you think that they're telling you the truth or not.
Now, so it sounds like we bring our own glasses a lot of times to see things.
Exactly.
And we're seeing them through these glasses that were made through our past experiences and associations and relationships. Do you go and explore those?
Yes, I try to get back into the idea of seeing everything as a beginner, so that you come into the relationship with all of the learning and the tools and the skills from your past, but without the preconceived judgments. Because the person that you're with now is or maybe is not, right? But they're basically going to have a different experience with you in some way than you've had before. Even if they have the same type of job and the same physical looks and the same this and that, they're still going to have a difference in the interaction. So you need to allow them, again, that idea of space, to show you who they really are. And that is only going to happen if you're willing to check your past experiences and judgments at the door.
That seems to be hard for people.
Absolutely. There's a lot of resistance to that. I think because we get comfort in defining ourselves by our pain and our experiences in the past.
That's an interesting way. Not a good thing to define yourself that way. That's for sure.
No, definitely. It is not going to help you long term, and especially if you're looking to forge a long-term relationship with somebody, you're going to have a much more difficult time if you're coming into it already knowing what the ending's going to be, without allowing it to actually unfold in the present.
Now, when you have a relationship, some of these marriages, I know like the guest we've had a week ago, she's been married for 30 years. Do they usually have compatible EQs?
You know, that's a really good question. I would say that on average, when I work with couples, the ones that usually are calling me in don't have compatible EQs, but that they can maybe work towards getting to be more in alignment with that. But that the couples I've seen that are successful long term do tend to have more equally measured EQs.
And do they necessarily have a high EQ or just compatible? Have you seen anything like that?
I would say it's basically more about the reflection of them being similar.
Being similar.
So that even if somebody has a low level of EQ and they're with somebody with a low level of EQ, well, that actually might be a good situation for them in some ways, because that person's going to be able to extend them the empathy that somebody with high EQ would try to do, but might not be able to fully realize just because they're coming from a different perspective.
Interesting. Great stuff. So we're going to cross geographical boundaries.
Okay.
What is it like in different cultures? I mean, do different cultures have different EQs? For instance, I'm thinking in my head right now that there's a certain particular culture, remain unnamed, that's known for being really strict, hide the emotions.
Right.
We're going to just pragmatism, science, give me the facts.
Well, there's definitely different cultural, obviously, valuations into emotion. But Ekman's work went and proved that there are universally expressed microexpressions. So that even if there's a culture that might have the tendency to not be able to display emotion as much, they still, without having to even think about it, so just autonomically, they're going to display the same types of expressions as those cultures that do have more openness to it.
That's interesting. How about the EQ level?
The EQ level, I actually don't know specifically in relation to other cultures if there's been any sort of research. I can say from personal experience with clients that I have seen a difference in people that are from different types of cultures as far as what they value in expressing emotions versus those that don't, and that there has been challenges, especially if they're working in environments where there's different cultures all mixed together, and if there's majority of the people there, let's say, that do value EQ, and then there's a few lone wolves that don't, they're really going to have a hard time.
So now we're going to tackle a stereotype that we all hear all the time, gender.
Okay.
Now, I'm guessing
You said it, not me.
That's right. I'm guessing here females have a higher EQ than males.
On average, yes.
On average.
Women do tend to have a higher level of emotional intelligence, but there are always exceptions. So that especially if you find a woman who, again, was more of that kind of loner personality, extremely introverted, or somebody who's maybe drawn more into some of the more technical fields, who wanted to be more at a laboratory level versus a interpersonal, like management or something like that, then she might have a lower level of EQ than her male counterpart. Who came from, let's say, a very expression-filled home where it was clouded to, promote your emotions and share your feelings and different things, then, so it does come into that nature versus nurture thing. But on the whole, my experience has been that women do tend to have a more innate sense of what EQ is.
You almost answered my other question I was getting ready to ask, too.
Mind reader.
Yeah, she is. She's reading my face, my mind. Do Does siblings matter then? 'Cause I'm thinking of males that have maybe a higher EQ. Are they usually maybe raised by sisters? Did you see any of that in your practice?
Well, I've looked at a couple things with siblings before, and I've definitely seen among sisters that if one has a high level of EQ, as long as there wasn't any major trauma differences between the sisters, as far as experiencing maybe some horrific experience in college or something like that, that on the average, the two sisters will be very similar. And among a brother and sister, what I've seen before is that there's been a similar sort of situation, but that the male does tend to have a lower measure overall than the female does.
Compared to his sister?
Correct.
Maybe? But maybe higher than the other
On
males
average,
that don't have
yes,
a sister?
exactly.
That's fascinating. So we can get higher EQ just by hanging around females.
That's right.
There you go. So that's great. So we learn how you help the people in the business in an individual setting as well as a group setting, helping them with EQ, being more self-aware, self-compassionate to ourselves, not being too hard
and
on
more
ourselves.
reflective too.
More reflective.
Yes.
That's excellent. Now, you are also a Pilates instructor.
Yes.
And we mentioned earlier in the show, you like the holistic view.
Yes, approaching.
So how does the Pilates work in here?
Well, so Pilates is more about your core intelligence, right? And it's about looking at your body as a holistic machine so that if you have a strong and stable core, kind of like if you think of maybe like a tree, right? So if the trunk of the tree is solid and strong, then the branches and the leaves are going to be able to move kind of without really much thought and a lot of ease. But there has to be those strong, stable roots in the ground. And that's what Pilates can provide you. It can provide you with understanding your weight distribution. So for instance, if you're sitting more in one hip than the other, then you're gonna have compensatory issues going on through your whole body because your muscles, they only know what they know. And so if there's been some sort of either injury or congenital issue or just a compensation, then they're doing the best job they can, but they might be sending work where it's not actually supposed to be.
Interesting. So how does it, okay, I understand Pilates in the sense that it can improve your posture,
Yes,
improve your self-awareness.
absolutely.
So would you incorporate that in any of your sessions?
I do. And that's how actually kind of I got into the work I'm doing presently is sort of by marrying those two ideas, because what I noticed was that in any alignment issue that somebody physically had, there was usually a misalignment of an emotional issue as well. And that if there was something emotionally going on, you could almost bet that there would also be some sort of physical manifestation. So there really was that mindful body or mind-body connection. And tying them together and being able to offer the programs that would tailor to the individual on both the physical and the emotional seemed to have the greatest level of success.
That's amazing stuff. Really amazing stuff. That was wonderful.
Thank you
You're
so much.
awesome. We learned a lot about EQ, a topic I really wasn't very familiar with. I've heard of Daniel Goleman in the past, but I really got a great lesson in the last 45 minutes from both parts. I hope you did as well. Thank you so much, Nanci, for coming out.
Thank you, Carlos.
That was
It's a
great.
pleasure.
If they want to get a hold of you, how do they do it?
Well, they can connect with me on LinkedIn at Nanci Besser. They can go to my website at nancibesser.com, NanciBesser.com. They can also find me on Twitter at Nanci Besser. I tweet quite a bit. And I welcome any and all questions. I try to respond personally to every email or message that I receive.
And I am connected with her on LinkedIn, and I'm telling you, she's got great posts. You definitely don't want to miss that. Once again, if you want to learn more about Circle of Insight, you can go to facebook.com/Circle of Insight, where you can look at daily updates, comment on today's show or past shows, and look at future shows. We're also now on iTunes Podcast, so you can listen to us in your car. Our next show coming up, we'll be talking about who is God? Do we need God? So we'll be challenging those tough questions coming up with Pastor Robert Schuller, Jr. Thank you very much again for everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.